Hi, welcome to my channel. If you've been following my previous videos on the composition of my first piano quintet, you'll know that I'm also working on a second piece at the moment. Its title is Hydra, and it will have 6 movements, each one named after a Greek letter, starting with zeta and going backwards to alpha. Hydra is a completely different type of work in my catalog, but before I explain why, let me tell you how the idea came about. It all started with the passing of my friend and colleague Haladhara Dasa. He was a very smart man, fascinated by art and science, a bit taciturn, but with a sense of humor, when he felt like it. And I found in him a certain spirit of kinship. We met several times to have coffee and talk about music, and at one of those meetings, he told me about his newly developed compositional method called Wave-Constellation. He explained it to me in detail and showed me the score of his most recent composition written using that method. I found it very interesting, but never thought of using it myself. In 2012, he gave a lecture at UPC, where I served as director of the School of Music. In it, he explained his method to the students and handed them a short booklet that we printed at the university. 3 years later, in 2015, he fell ill and died shortly after. His death made me very sad because I really enjoyed talking to him and exchanging our ideas about musical composition and science. However, I must say that he was overjoyed. He was going to be with Krishna and was very happy about it, and somehow that comforted me. One thing that Haladhara wanted with his method was to convince other composers to use it. In fact, he had come to the conclusion that it could be used by multiple composers working together in a collaborative composition. He called this the Hydra project, after the mythical creature of the Greek tradition. After his death, I had the idea to compose a piece in his memory. I spent a few years wondering what exactly to write. Then it occurred to me that the piece in question would have to be written using his method, and I remembered that I had a copy of the booklet. I studied it thoroughly, filling in some gaps with what I remembered from our meetings, making some minor adjustments, and even automating part of the process with the help of a spreadsheet. Then I found the article where he explained the Hydra project and decided that would be the name of the piece. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the development of contemporary classical music, you might be wondering what the heck is a method of musical composition. The answer to that would require several videos, but in short, since the first quarter of the 20th century, several composers have devised algorithmic and mathematical procedures to create their works. Their main motivation being to overcome the natural tendency of the mind to organize sounds so that they conform to familiar patterns of a tradition of some sort. So these methods allow them to produce a result that sounds different and novel. Haladhara was familiar with this idea and came up with his method for 2 additional reasons. First, he was looking for a particular kind of aesthetic for his music, so he created his method to produce a very specific type of result. And secondly, the blank page made him quite anxious. He explained it to me once more or less this way. If I write a note, say C, a question arises in my mind. Why a C? Why not a C sharp? Why not an E or a G? If somehow I finally make up my mind and go for a C, the whole dilemma starts all over again. I think the extreme freedom that modern composers enjoy terrified him. He needed some kind of foundation, something that limited his options to a few possibilities. By the way, you can hear some of Haladhara's works on his SoundCloud channel, which is still live. However, I have to point out 2 things. The first is that you must remember that he was looking for a very specific aesthetic, which is not exactly common. You may like it or not, that's up to you. Personally, I find his music very interesting. Second, all the tracks are computer mock-ups. Unfortunately, his music has not been played much, and for reasons I don't know, he didn't upload the few recordings that he had access to. Still, the demos are good enough to listen to and get a basic idea of what the piece would sound like when performed by live musicians. There are also some purely electronic tracks for which the above doesn't apply, of course. I'll put a link to his channel in the description. So what is the Wave-Constellation method of musical composition? How does it work, and what kind of result it produces? I'm afraid there's no short way to sum it up, so please bear with me. The method could best be described as a kind of paper program, rather than one for a computer. Haladhara made some adjustments to it over the years, but the basic idea remained. The purpose of the method, as I said before, is to limit the freedom of the composer to very few options, and to let him produce a work with a very specific kind of aesthetic. It's inspired by serialism, but unlike it, the result is not a fixed sequence of musical events. In the first part, the wave, the composer creates a matrix of 12 rows and a chart of rhythmic possibilities, and uses both to establish the rhythms of each section of the composition. In the second part, a chord created by the composer serves as a means to obtain 12 sets of 6 pitches each, 12 constellations. The composer then combines both parts of the process, arbitrarily assigning the pitches of each constellation, the stars, to the rhythms obtained in the first part. In Haladhara's terms, the composer pours the notes into the rhythmic molds. Details like the precise octave, articulation, dynamics, etc. are left to the discretion of the composer. The result is very consistent and organic, and if the initial set of conditions is not too narrow, the method leaves enough room for intuition and play. Let me explain how the first part of the method works. The first task of the composer is to choose two numbers with a large sequence of decimals, preferably infinite, but this is not a requirement. Haladhara had a preference for pi and Euler's number. Of course, he could simply write a long sequence of digits, but I guess that felt too arbitrary for him, although I have to admit it's already arbitrary to choose a specific pair of numbers, but anyway. The numbers must be written in the first and last rows of a 12-row matrix, truncated to a certain decimal, of course. By the way, the decimal point is omitted. It's useless in the method. Haladhara then ran into a problem. Some of the digits in these numbers are zeros. And as you will understand in a moment, zeros don't work for this part of the process. Therefore, he performed a very simple operation. He added 1 to each digit, thus preserving the relationships between them, like scaling an object but preserving the proportions. The next operation is known as the first hug, or embrace, but Haladhara used the English word hug in various documents I have. The two numbers have to reach each other, so to speak, and this is where the name wave for this part of the method comes from. We have to connect the outer rows, and to do so we write a wave of numbers by adding or subtracting 1. For example, in the first column we have the numbers 4 and 3, so to get from the first row to the last, we simply subtract and add 1 consecutively until we reach the destination number. In column 5 we must connect a 6 with a 3, so we subtract 1 until we get to 3, and then we add 1 to get back to 6. Since there are not enough rows left for another cycle, the last wave is smaller. Sometimes the operation produces numbers of the same values in rows 11 and 12. There is simply no other alternative, believe me. According to Haladhara's rules, the number in row 11 must be 1 unit of difference or identical to the number in row 12. If the numbers in rows 1 and 12 are the same, no wave is produced. The connection is simply a repetition of the same number, in other words, a flat curve. The next operation is the second hug, but Haladhara indicated in a document that I have that this operation is optional, and in fact, I'm taking his word and I'm not using it in Hydra. To explain what it is, I have to show you the kind of result that he was looking for. These are known as nested tuplets, in other words, tuplets within tuplets. The idea behind this is that the pulse is not constant. It changes from one group of measures to another, or even from one measure to the next. The second hug is then an operation that converts all the terms in the matrix into ratios. Haladhara came up with different ways to do this. The most common involved dividing the matrix in half horizontally. He called this the mirror function. Each term in the upper half is modified by the next term, and vice versa for the terms in the lower half. So for example, the 4 in row 1, column 1 is modified by the 3 below, and we end up with a ratio of 3 to 4, which means 3 beats in the time of 4. That's why the zeros in the original numbers wouldn't work. If we apply the second hug to the matrix, we get this modified version. So now you know what the purpose of the matrix was. However, I said earlier that this part of the method produces the rhythms of the piece, and so far we only have the beats. The next operation is then to subdivide the beats to create the rhythms. Haladhara called this the micro-division, and over the years he came up with different ways to do it. The first were very mathematical, but the last one was simply to create a rhythm chart, like the one here, which is a chart from one of Haladhara's works called Padapadma 1. The procedure is then as follows. For each term of the modified matrix, we take from the original matrix as many numbers as the first in the ratio. So using the term in row 1, column 1 again, we take 3 numbers from the original matrix, starting with the number in row 1, column 1, and moving to the right, which gives us the sequence 4, 2, 5. I don't know what Haladhara did when he got to the last column. I assume that he applied a vertical mirror function or something of a kind, and took the numbers to the left of the term. However, why do it only horizontally? Why not vertically, or diagonally, or even clockwise or counterclockwise? I don't know. In fact, this is what I did in Hydra, but I'll show that to you in my next video. Once we have the sequence of numbers for each term, we go back to the chart and choose from it the rhythms that we want to use. This chart is of course completely arbitrary, and as you can see, Haladhara only had one option for numbers 1 and 2, and 2 options for the rest. By the way, the T represents the number 10. I assume that the degree of limitation in this chart is left to the discretion of the composer. I don't see any reason not to have more options. Also, you can see that Haladhara's rhythms for Padapadma 1 are perhaps a little too mathematical, but again, he was looking for a very specific type of result, and these are the rhythms that would allow him to produce it. I have used a slightly modified approach for Hydra, as we'll see next week. An interesting thing is that Haladhara decided the rhythms of the entire composition before writing the music. You can see the result of that here. In addition, he distributed the rhythms among the instruments, so the rhythms don't necessarily apply to a single instrument, which is possible, but are usually the result of the sum of many or all of them. I also took a different approach to this, but this video is already too long, so I'll leave it here for now. I hope you found this video interesting. If you do, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to be notified every time I post a new one. Next week, I'll explain the second part of Haladhara's method, the constellations, and show you how I applied the entire method to Hydra. If there's enough time, I may also show you a fragment of Hydra's first movement. Until then, take care. Ciao.